right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. This morning we're going to look at the last chapter in the book of John. And I don't claim to be a mental health professional. And I don't actually know much about mental health caregiving. But I do know a little bit about healing, and I know a little bit about forgiveness, and I know about finding a forgiveness that can disarm a heart that has been hurt, a heart that has buried those feelings of hurt, of fear, of failure, of sin, has buried those things away to try not to deal with it. And this morning, I want to look at especially how Jesus brings those feelings back up again. Because one thing I didn't point out in the class was Peter forgiven? Well, yes, Jesus had died on the cross. He'd been forgiven. Those sins have been dealt with. Then why did Jesus bring it up again? And so I've had the privilege, working in this position, to work with people and lead them into dealing with some of those things. And I've had the privilege of watching some very deep, unhealed wounds be gently exposed, be gently washed off and dealt with in love and prayer, and finally be able to find some healing in those things. And that's one of the things that I think is going on here in chapter 21, is that it begins with, the healing begins with a visual image for us, a campfire and fishing. Two of my favorite things to do, right? Campfires and fishing. But I want us to notice how John is, again, this is not the first time he's done it, but again in his account to us, is using these visual images for us to draw our attention to a metaphor. And this time we're looking at, in verse 4, he's pointing to a risen Jesus. When daybreak came, Jesus stood on the shore, but his disciples did not know it was Jesus. Friends, Jesus called to them, you don't have any fish, do you? John is telling us in this story that the day has dawned, a new day has dawned. And there's two different ways of looking at this day. One is looking at it as full of beauty and possibility. But not everybody in the story sees it that way, right? From the point of view of Peter, the dawn meant the end of fishing. He'd been out fishing all night and straining the water. He's thinking about the failure of the trip, because when dawn comes, it's time to come in. But why had Peter gone fishing in the first place? That's a question I want to ask. And I think it's a puzzle for us. A puzzle, like half the things that Peter proposes to do in John's Gospel and the book of Acts, half the things he proposes to do, they come from the right motivation. He wants to do something good, but maybe the wrong judgment he's making on these things. Peter wanted to get on with life. He wanted to do the next thing, right? And fishing was the world that he knew best. You know, they both had, many of the disciples had, well, all of them, had families that needed looking after, right? Families that might have suggested that they come back and come fishing, or settle down, or do something more reasonable than following somebody around for a few years. like earning money or catching some fish for the family. But the plan didn't work out, right? Their plan didn't work out. These guys knew this fishing grounds, though, right? They knew this sea, if we want to call it that. They weren't green. They were old hands, or like they say in Alaska, they were sourdoughs, like they say up north. But the dawn is breaking, it says here. And they see the sky. Think of yourself as being there. They see the sky filling with color from the sun, and as they're stretching and they're shivering from a slight chill in the air, and they're tired, they're ready for some food, and they don't have any fish. And it's at that moment that Jesus comes and calls out to them. Of course, they don't know it's him at first, but suddenly they realize that it's him. And Peter longed to see Jesus again, because he clearly still had some unfinished business with him. So he quickly grabs his coat and he ties it around him and he jumps in the water. And once again, we see Peter doing the impulsive thing, right? Leaving the others to do the hard work and going and doing the impulsive thing. Let's go back a second, though. Why were they fishing? It's a puzzle why they went fishing. And I'm not saying I have the right answer here. But it's another puzzle to try and work out why John has really told us this story, right? I think John is telling us partially to set the scene for this almost unbearably tense dialogue that's going to happen in verses 15 through 19, right? This is tense, deep stuff. But I think the story of Peter jumping in the water sort of has its own meaning of its own, too. Jesus had given his followers a powerful commission just in chapter 20, right? In verse 22. And when he has said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you withhold forgiveness of any, it is withheld." They're supposed to be working for him. They're to be filled with God's own life breath, his Spirit. And they're supposed to be sent out into the world just like Jesus had been, teaching others how to have their sins forgiven through the words that they were going to tell them. But if they try and do it their own way, they're going to fail. They're going to work all night and take home nothing. And so the only way for them to move forward is to admit defeat, to listen to Jesus' voice again here by this fire on the shore, right? To admit defeat and to do what he says. Then there's no telling what they will be able to achieve. So I want us to close our eyes again and stand with the disciples in that boat. And think about for yourself, what projects have you been working on? Have you been laboring on? What projects have you been laboring on and getting nowhere on? Jesus says to watch for the dawn. Watch for the dawn. Watch for the figure on the shore. Listen to his voice. Listen to the Messiah, Jesus, his voice, and do what he tells you to do. To put your trust in him and not in your own skills. So we've had two stories that have sort of brought us to this point. And John is using those stories as sort of a rhetorical device. And we have the smell of fire, a charcoal fire, which is the last time we saw a fire in, especially when it uses that word charcoal fire, the same words. But we got to remember the whole story of Peter. Remember in chapter 13, he loudly, emphatically says, right, that he will remain loyal to Jesus no matter what. He's not going to let him down. He wants to go with him wherever he goes, to prison, to death, wherever. Peter's going to be there with him. In fact, he's prepared to lay down his own life, he says at the end of chapter 13. And then in chapter 18, we watch with this feeling of just helplessness as Peter tries and he fails again and again and again. He follows Jesus, but only at a distance. When he gets there, everything goes horribly wrong. And instead of quickly getting out before things get worse, right, he stays down and doubles down again, and then he stays down and triples down. 3 times he denies that he's one of Jesus' followers. And that, of course, the rooster crows, and he remembers. And all of that happens beside a charcoal fire. And I think back to that smell of that fire. And you can, would have been coming through the chilly air. Remember, he was chilled. Depends on what time of the year this was, but if it was around Passover or Pentecost, it would have been in April or May sometime, possibly. Think of Peter going out in shame, angry at himself, knowing that Jesus knew that he denied him, knowing that the beloved disciple knew that he denied him, knowing that God knew, and hearing the next day what had happened to Jesus. Remember, he had taken off. He was gone. Not even the resurrection itself could get rid of that memory there for Peter. Nothing could get rid of that memory except by revisiting it and looking at that memory in the light of God's own healing and forgiveness. And so they've caught this massive net full of fish now, right? Jesus has told them, put out the net and you'll catch. And they know. They've been fishing all night. There's not any fish. Enough for breakfast for a whole village, probably. But then Jesus is already cooking fish and bread by this charcoal fire. He doesn't need their catch. John is carefully describing this scene for us. He's not wasting words here. These are not overly flowery words that he's using. John doesn't do that in his stories. He's telling us something about working at Jesus' own direction. Something about the relation of our work to Jesus' work, to his own work. And I think it's easy for us as Christians to get the impression that we've got to do everything for God. Sometimes we think that God, as we imagine, maybe is passively waiting for us to take care of things. Or maybe we don't think that overtly, but we think that if we don't organize it, it won't happen. If we don't go change the world won't be changed. He has no hands but our hands. Have you ever heard that? We're sometimes told. And I think that we need to carry that out with last week's garbage. Because God can do whatever he wants to do. He's the creator of this world. Whose hand made the sun rise this morning? It was God's hand. Of course we're supposed to be working hard. Of course we need to be organized as a group and do those things. But this is not about poor old Jesus who's unable to have a fish on the shore unless we go catch it for him. Right? He has fish, but he wants us to bring him fish. And they were surprised by this huge catch. Right? They're surprised by Jesus himself. And maybe they were surprised by their own selves, by themselves. Who were they? What were they doing? What was going to happen next? That's what they're thinking in their life right now. With Jesus right in front of them, they're thinking this now. And now the scene switches to just between Jesus and Peter as we move into verse 15. And this is one of the most powerful verbal exchanges in the Bible, and I don't know, maybe in all of literature, if we want to use some hyperbole. But the most amazing thing about this is that through forgiveness, Jesus is giving Peter a job to do. And when Peter professes his love, Jesus doesn't say, well, that's all right, that's good enough for me. Right? He says, well then, feed my... The first word he uses is not sheep. Feed my lambs. Feed my lambs. Look after my sheep. Feed my sheep. And these three questions correspond, of course, to Peter's own three denials. 3 for completeness, like Jay was saying, there's often numbers are important. But 3 also for a reminder. Right? We can smell the charcoal fire when we hear that third one. It's like a bell going off. Peter's night of agony, of denying Jesus, and Jesus' own night of agony, those ideas, those events return to us. But because of Jesus' night of agony, now Peter's pain and his sin can be dealt with. Jesus is the Passover lamb who takes away the sin of the world, and that includes Peter's sin, right? And your sin, and my sin. Now, officially, if we've had that sin washed away from us, there is no record of it. It's not like something he's going to pull back out and, hold it over your head again. That's not what happens. It's gone. The skeletons are gone from the closet. But there still might be plenty of pain in our memories, in our imaginations, though. We remember our old failings. We remember our old sores and wounds. And we need to deal with it before we can operate at that sort of maximum efficiency. Right? And so Jesus goes to where the pain is in Peter's life. Like he so often does, right? Can you imagine the Samaritan woman? When he talks to her, goes right to where the problem is. He takes Simon Peter, away from the others. There in verse 20. They're walking away. And the beloved disciple, he's following, but at a distance. Maybe they're walking slowly along the shore, having a conversation. And he asks the question that goes to the heart of it all. He says, "Do you love me?" And the answer Peter gives each time doesn't earn him a pat on the back, not a, all right, then that's good. But it earns Peter a command, a fresh challenge, a new commission, a time to learn how to not be a sheep anymore, but a time to learn how to be a shepherd. Time to feed the lambs, to feed the sheep, and to look after them. Jesus is trusting Peter not only, to get back to the work of bearing fruit. Jesus is sharing his own work, his own ministry with Jesus, so that he can become more like him. And so, Peter, let me just say this. And I want everybody to listen real close, because this is the secret of all Christian ministry. Let me just put it out there. This is the secret of me working here in ministry, of you living a ministry in your own life. It's the secret to every elder, every lay person, every full-time, part-time, volunteer, whoever. If you're going to do a single action as a volunteer or as a servant of Jesus, this is what it needs to be built on. Somewhere deep down inside, there needs to be a love for Jesus. Because even though, goodness knows how many times each one of us has let Jesus down. Jesus wants to reach inside and find that love to give you a chance to express it. Just like he did with Peter. He wants to find that love and the hurt and the failures of your past. And he wants to give you a new work to do. And these new things that he gives you don't earn your forgiveness, right? You've already got that part. Nothing you can do can earn your forgiveness. These are things that you do out of the joy and the relief that you are forgiven. These are things that Jesus gives us to do as a sign to the world that we are forgiven. And let me just tell you that those actions are going to be costly, because Jesus' own work was ultimately costly, right? Cost him his own life. These actions that Jesus wants us to do, that he's commissioning us to do as we bring our own hurt and our own sin to him, and as he forgives us, these actions mean that following him means following him into suffering and maybe even death, right? In the last week, I've been working on this sermon, right? More Christians, I've been reading in the news, have been killed around the world because they were worshiping Jesus. Someone else will dress you, will take you where you'd rather not go, Jesus says. Peter will complete his work as a shepherd by laying down his own life for the sheep. Verse 21. When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about him?" We went over this in class quite a bit, so I won't go over it too deep here, but Jesus didn't say that John would stay until he returned. He only said that it's none of Peter's business. And so in verse 25, there's many things that Jesus also did. And if they were written down one by one, I don't think that the world itself would be able to contain the books that would be written. Of course, this is written in a specific time period, right? Nowadays, I can contain all of the world's library on a USB stick, right? But that's not the point. The world wouldn't be able to contain them because they would be too explosive. It would be like trying to play this wonderful symphony on a broken piano. That's how the world would look at his writings, because they don't understand them. Be like trying to serve a gourmet meal from a snack bar. Right? It would be like God's breath inside an ordinary human being. It would be like light shining in the darkness, all these books, and the darkness being unable to master the message. This world cannot handle the message. And the ultimate point here is this, is that once the word of those books has become flesh, all of the books in the world can't do justice to what he has become. Nothing less than human flesh that he became can now do justice to the meaning of the word. And I'm not talking about Jesus' flesh anymore. I'm talking about your flesh and our flesh. We can do justice to the meaning of the word becoming flesh, because the world can't contain that message, but we can contain the message, and we can take that message out into the world. Our flesh can. In our lives, if we live our lives in the power of the Spirit, can take that message a lot further than just throwing a book out into the world. Jesus' disciples are sent into the world, not just in the first century, right? But in every generation that lives by this message. The world is the object of God's love. That's what John 3:16 is all about. God so loved the world that he sent his only Son to die. He was sent into the world by the Father, and he now sends us into the world. And whatever part that we get to play in this story, we go to that part with his words. Let me just read what I'm trying to say here. Maybe it'll make more sense. John chapter 16 and verse 33 says, one more page over. Let me back up. Jesus answered them, "Do you now believe? Behold, the hour is coming. Indeed, it has come when you will be scattered, each to his own home, and will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me. I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart. I have overcome the world." Jesus says you'll have trouble in the world, but cheer up, because I have defeated the world. I have overcome the world. That's the message that John leaves us with here in John chapter 21. A message of forgiveness, but a message of being conscripted into the work. If you haven't given your allegiance to Jesus, if you haven't put your faith in him, you need to. He's the only one who can offer that true forgiveness to wipe away the sin and guilt. If you need to do that, we can help you with that. We have the waters of baptism here to represent his blood. It washes away our sins. If you have done that and you've made mistakes and you need to come back, we can help you with that. If you need anything, let us know, and we will try to help you with those things. It's good to have everybody here this morning. Next week, we'll look at the church that Jesus built. Will be the topic next week. It's good to have everybody.